On November 9, 1958, a man named Ronald was looking out the window of a small transport plane. He was a geologist, and his job was to find oil in the heart of the Libyan desert. Below him, the sand stretched out for hundreds of miles in every direction, a flat sea of beige and gray. It was a place where nothing lived and nothing changed. But then, he saw something shiny. It was the silhouette of a massive 4-engine bomber resting perfectly on the dunes. It looked brand new, as if it had just landed. But there were no airfields for hundreds of miles. What he found that day would change everything we knew about a ghost from the past. The 9 men inside that bomber didn't want to become a legend. They were young, tired, and very far from home. It was their very first combat mission, and they were nervous. All they really wanted was to drop their bombs and get back to the base for a hot meal. They wanted a soft bed and the feeling of solid ground under their boots. They wanted to survive the war and go back to their families. But the desert had a different plan for them, and it started with a single piece of equipment that couldn't tell the difference between home and a grave. The plane was a B-24 Liberator, a heavy machine built for long distances. It had 4 massive engines and a nose painted with the name Lady Be Good in elegant script. On April 4, 1943, it sat on the runway at Salvaged Airfield near Benghazi. The air was thick with a rising sandstorm that choked the engines before they even started. Have you ever felt the grit of sand between your teeth? 9 men climbed inside, led by a pilot named William Hatton. They carried a thermos of hot coffee and enough fuel to reach Italy and back. Tucked into the cockpit was a radio direction finder with a single-loop antenna. It was a simple tool, designed to point the way home. Beyond the airfield lay the Calancio Sand Sea. It was a place so dry that even the wind seemed to die there. Nobody lived there. No one ever went there. It was just a blank spot on the map, hundreds of miles from the war. It was a place of silence and heat. At 2:50 in the afternoon, the Lady Be Good finally took off. It was one of the last planes to leave the ground. The sandstorm was so bad that 9 other bombers turned back almost immediately. But Hatton and his crew kept going, pushing through the dust into the clear air above. By 7:50 that evening, they were 25,000 feet over the harbor of Naples. The clouds were too thick to see the target. They circled, searching for a gap in the gray, but the visibility was zero. So, they dumped their bombs into the dark Mediterranean Sea to save weight. They turned the nose of the plane south, heading for the safety of Libya. The sun went down, and the world turned into a featureless black void. By midnight, they should have seen the lights of the coast. They saw nothing but darkness. At 12:12, Hatton keyed his radio. He asked the base for a bearing to guide them home. The base operator checked his equipment and sent back a heading of 330 degrees. Hatton turned the wheel. He believed he was still over the ocean. He was wrong. The radio direction finder had a fatal flaw. The loop antenna could tell you the line of a signal, but it couldn't tell you if the signal was in front of you or behind you. The crew thought they were north of the base, flying south toward land. In reality, they had already flown over the base in the dark. They were flying deeper and deeper into the Sahara Desert. At 2 in the morning, the engines began to sputter. The fuel gauges hit empty. Hatton ordered everyone to jump. They stepped out into the black air, believing they would splash into the cold water of the Mediterranean. Instead, they hit the soft, dry sand of the dunes. 8 of the men found each other in the dark by shouting and firing flares. They huddled together, waiting for the sun to rise so they could swim to shore. But one man, the bombardier John Waravka, did not answer. His parachute had failed, and he lay alone in the sand. The survivors looked around, but they couldn't see anything in the pitch black. They waited for the sound of waves that never came. When the sun came up, the 8 men realized their mistake. There was no ocean. There was no coast. There was only an endless, undulating sea of sand that glowed a hellish orange. They had one canteen of water between them. They decided to walk north, thinking the sea was only a few miles away. How far would you walk for a drink of water? They walked for 8 days in a heat that reached 130 degrees. They left behind bits of clothing and equipment to mark their path. They even left behind their parachutes, weighted down with stones to guide rescuers. Their skin turned black from the sun. Their tongues swelled until they couldn't speak. One by one, they began to fall. 5 of them stopped when they could go no further. They lay down together in the shade of a small dune, waiting for an end that was certain. 2 others, Guy Shelley and Harold Ripslinger, kept crawling for miles. They were looking for help that didn't exist. They were over 400 miles from the nearest town. They were walking into the most desolate place on Earth. In 1959, a ground team finally reached the wreck Ronald had seen from the air. The plane was snapped in half, but it was not a crash site. It was a perfect landing. The propellers were not bent. The landing gear was still tucked away. The plane had landed itself. When they climbed inside, they found the radio still worked. They found a thermos, and the coffee inside was still liquid and drinkable after 15 years. They found the machine guns, and when they pulled the triggers, the guns fired perfectly into the dunes. The desert had frozen time. Then they found the diaries. Robert Toner had kept a log of their slow death in the sand. The entries showed they had walked 85 miles from the crash site. The last entry was dated April 12, 1943. It was a single sentence about the end of their hope. They had survived for 8 days on a single canteen of water. The United States Air Force launched Operation 27 to find the men. They followed the trail of discarded flight jackets and boots through the desert. They found the first 5 bodies huddled together, miles from anywhere. Then they found Shelley and Ripslinger, who had pushed themselves even further across the sand. They found the body of the navigator Hayes near a small pile of stones. Each discovery confirmed the incredible feat of endurance these men had performed. They had walked further than anyone thought possible in that heat. The loop antenna from the setup had led them to their deaths, but their discipline kept them together until the very end. Even after the search ended, 1 man remained missing. Sergeant Vernon Moore was never found by the official team. A British patrol had found a body years earlier, but they didn't know who it was and the location was lost. Somewhere in the shifting dunes, he is still out there. He is the only member of the Lady Be Good who never came home. He is a part of the desert now. The sand covers and uncovers the secrets of that night as the years pass. Now we know exactly what happened that night. The crew overflew their base because the wind was stronger than they realized. The radio error gave them a heading that felt right, but was exactly 180 degrees wrong. After they jumped, the Lady Be Good didn't crash. It flew on autopilot for 16 miles and landed itself gently on the sand. But the story didn't end in the desert. Parts were salvaged from the wreck and put into other planes. Soon, the mechanics began to talk. They said the Lady Be Good was still flying, in pieces. A cargo plane using its transmitters had to dump its load to avoid crashing. Another plane with a salvaged radio ditched into the sea. A small transport plane with a salvaged armrest crashed with no survivors. People began to whisper that the Lady Be Good was carrying a curse. The geologist in the transport plane looked down at the silver wings one last time before flying away. The desert is a place that keeps what it takes. It kept the Lady Be Good for 15 years, and it kept the secret of their courage for even longer. The Lady Be Good sits in a military base now, stripped and rusted by the wind. It is no longer a time capsule, just a collection of metal and memories. The men who walked 85 miles for a drink of water are finally at rest. On November 9, 1958, Ronald looked out a window and saw a ghost. The desert is still there, and it is still empty. Subscribe for more stories that time forgot.